The Radical Republicans were a faction of American politicians within the Second Republican Party of the United States from about 1854 until the end of Reconstruction in 1877. They called themselves Radicals, and were opposed during the war by the moderate Republicans, by the conservative Republicans, and by the pro-slavery Democratic Party. After the war, the Radicals were opposed by self-styled conservatives and liberals. Radicals strongly opposed slavery during the war and after the war distrusted ex-Confederates, demanding harsh policies for the former rebels, and emphasizing civil rights and voting rights for their freedmen. During the war, Radical Republicans often opposed Lincoln in terms of selection of generals and his efforts to bring seceded Southern states back into the Union as quickly and easily as possible. The Radicals passed their own Reconstruction plan through the Congress in 1864, but Lincoln vetoed it and was putting his own presidential policies in effect by virtue as military commander-in-chief when he was assassinated in April 1865. Radicals pushed for the uncompensated abolition of slavery, while Lincoln wanted to pay slave owners who were loyal to the Union. After the war, the Radicals demanded civil rights for freedmen, such as measures ensuring suffrage. They initiated the various Reconstruction Acts, and limited political and voting rights for ex-Confederate civil officials, military officers and soldiers. They bitterly fought 17th President Andrew Johnson. They weakened his powers and attempted to remove him from office through impeachment, which failed by one vote in 1868. The Radicals were vigorously opposed by the National Democratic Party and often by moderate and liberal Republicans as well. The Radical Coalition. The term "radical" was in common use in the anti-slavery movement before the Civil War, referring not to abolitionists but to Northern politicians strongly opposed to slave power. Many, perhaps a majority, had been Whigs, such as William Seward, a leading presidential contender in 1860 and Lincoln's Secretary of State, Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, and Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, the leading radical newspaper. There was movement in both directions. Some of the pre-war radicals became more conservative during the war, while some pre-war moderates became radicals. Some wartime radicals had been conservative Democrats before the war, often taking pro-slavery positions. They included John A. Logan of Illinois, Edwin Stanton of Ohio, Benjamin Butler of Massachusetts, Ulysses S. Grant of Illinois, and Vice President Andrew Johnson in a pamphlet directed to black voters in 1867. The Union Republican Congressional Committee stated, "The word radical as applied to political parties and politicians, means one who is in favor of going to the root of things, who is thoroughly in earnest, who desires that slavery should be abolished, that every disability connected therewith should be obliterated." The Radicals were never formally organized, and there was movement in and out of the group. Their most successful and systematic leader was Pennsylvania Congressman Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives. The Democrats were strongly opposed to the Radicals, but they were generally a weak minority in politics until they took control of the House in the 1874 congressional elections. The moderate and conservative Republican factions usually opposed the Radicals, but they were not well organized. Lincoln tried to build a multi-faction coalition, including radicals, conservatives, moderates, and war Democrats. While he was often opposed by the Radicals, he never ostracized them. Andrew Johnson was thought to be a radical when he became president in 1865, but he soon became their leading opponent. Johnson, however, was so inept as a politician he was unable to form a cohesive support network. Finally, in 1872, the liberal Republicans, most of them ex-radicals, ran a presidential campaign, and won the support of the Democratic Party for their ticket. They argued that Grant and the Radicals were corrupt, and had imposed Reconstruction far too long on the South. They were overwhelmingly defeated and collapsed as a movement. on issues not concerned with the slave power, the destruction of the Confederacy, the eradication of slavery and the rights of the freedmen. Radicals took positions all over the political map. For example, radicals who had once been Whigs generally supported high tariffs, and ex-Democrats generally opposed them. Some men were for hard money and no inflation, and others were for soft money and inflation. The argument, common in the 1930s, that the radicals were primarily motivated by a desire to selfishly promote Northeastern business interests, has seldom been argued by historians for a half-century. On foreign policy issues, the radicals and moderates generally did not take distinctive positions. Wartime. After the 1860 elections, moderate Republicans dominated the Congress. Radical Republicans were often critical of Lincoln, who they believed was too slow in freeing slaves and supporting their legal equality. Lincoln put all factions in his cabinet, including radicals like Salmon P. Chase, whom he later appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, James Speed and Edwin M. Stanton. Lincoln appointed many radical Republicans, such as journalist James Shepard Pike, to key diplomatic positions. Angry with Lincoln, in 1864 some radicals briefly formed a political party called the Radical Democracy Party with John C. Fremont as their candidate for president, until Fremont withdrew. An important Republican opponent of the Radical Republicans was Henry Jarvis Raymond. Raymond was both editor of the New York Times and also a chairman of the Republican National Committee. In Congress, the most influential Radical Republicans were U.S. Senator Charles Sumner and U.S. Representative Thaddeus Stevens. They led the call for a war that would end slavery. Reconstruction policy. Opposing Lincoln, the Radical Republicans opposed Lincoln's terms for reuniting the United States during Reconstruction, which began in 1863, which they viewed as too lenient. They proposed an ironclad oath that would prevent anyone who supported the Confederacy from voting in Southern elections. Lincoln blocked it. Radicals passed the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864. Lincoln vetoed it. The Radicals demanded a more aggressive prosecution of the war, a faster end to slavery and total destruction of the Confederacy. After the war, the Radicals controlled the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, opposing Johnson. After the assassination of Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson became president. Although he appeared at first to be a radical, he broke with them, and the Radicals and Johnson became embroiled in a bitter struggle. Johnson proved a poor politician and his allies lost heavily in the 1866 elections in the North. The Radicals now had full control of Congress and could override Johnson's vetoes. Control of Congress. After the 1866 elections, the Radicals generally controlled Congress. Johnson vetoed 21 bills passed by Congress during his term, but the Radicals overrode 15 of them, including the Reconstruction Acts and Enforcement Acts, which rewrote the election laws for the South and allowed blacks to vote, while prohibiting most leading whites from holding office, if they had supported the Confederacy. As a result of 1867–68 elections, the newly empowered freedmen, in coalition with carpetbaggers and scalawags, set up Republican governments in 10 Southern states. They were supported by the Radicals in Washington, who sent in the army to support the new state governments. Impeachment. The Radical plan was to remove Johnson from office, but the first effort at impeachment went nowhere. After Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act by dismissing Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, the House of Representatives voted to impeach him. He escaped removal from office by the Senate by a single vote in 1868, but had lost most of his power. Supporting Grant. General Ulysses S. Grant in 1865–68 was in charge of the Army under President Johnson, but Grant generally enforced the radical agenda. The leading radicals in Congress were Thaddeus Stevens in the House, and Charles Sumner in the Senate. Grant was elected as a Republican in 1868. After the election, he generally sided with the Radicals on Reconstruction policies and signed the Civil Rights Act of 1871 into law. The Republicans split in 1872 over Grant's re-election, with the liberal Republicans, including Sumner, opposing Grant with a new third party. The Liberals lost badly, but the economy then went into a depression in 1873, and in 1874 the Democrats swept back into power and ended the reign of the Radicals. The Radicals tried to protect the new coalition, but one by one the southern states voted the Republicans out of power until in 1876 only 3 were left, where the Army still protected them. The 1876 presidential election was so close it was decided in those 3 states, despite massive fraud and illegalities on both sides. The Compromise of 1877 called for the election of a Republican as president, and his withdrawal of the troops. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes withdrew the troops. The Republican state regimes immediately collapsed. Reconstruction of the South. During Reconstruction, radical Republicans increasingly took control, led by Sumner and Stevens. They demanded harsher measures in the South, and more protection for the freedmen, and more guarantees that the Confederate nationalism was totally eliminated. Following Lincoln's assassination in 1865, Andrew Johnson, a former Wall Democrat, became president. The Radicals at first admired Johnson's hardline talk. When they discovered his ambivalence on key issues by his veto of Civil Rights Act of 1866, they overrode his veto. This was the first time that Congress had overridden a president on an important bill. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 made African Americans United States citizens and forbade discrimination against them. It was to be enforced in federal courts. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution of 1868 was the work of a coalition formed of both moderate and radical Republicans. By 1866, the radical Republicans supported federal civil rights for freedmen, which Johnson opposed. By 1867, they defined terms for suffrage for freed slaves and limited early suffrage for many ex-Confederates. While Johnson opposed the radical Republicans on some issues, the decisive congressional elections of 1866 gave the Radicals enough votes to enact their legislation over Johnson's vetoes. Through elections in the South, ex-Confederate officeholders were gradually replaced with a coalition of freedmen, Southern whites, and Northerners who had resettled in the South. The radical Republicans impeached Andrew Johnson in the House but failed by 1 vote in the Senate to remove him from office. The radical Republicans led the Reconstruction of the South. All Republican factions supported Ulysses S. Grant for president in 1868. Once in office, Grant forced Sumner out of the party. Grant used federal power to try to break up the Ku Klux Klan organization. Insurgents, however, and community riots continued harassment and violence against African Americans and their allies into the early 20th century. By 1872, the liberal Republicans thought that Reconstruction had succeeded and should end. Many moderates joined their cause as well as radical Republican leader Charles Sumner. They lost as Grant was easily re-elected. In state after state in the South, the Redeemers movement seized control from the Republicans, until only 3 Republican states were left in 1876. South Carolina, Florida and Louisiana. Republican presidential candidate Rutherford B. Hayes announced that he favored restoring home rule in these states, provided they promised to respect the rights of the freedmen. When Hayes became president in 1877, he ordered the removal of federal troops and Redeemers took over in these states as well. Liberal Republicans and Democrats argued the radical Republicans were corrupt by the acts of accepting bribes. These opponents of the Radicals demanded amnesty for all ex-Confederates, restoring their right to vote and hold public office. Foner's History of Reconstruction pointed out that sometimes the financial chicanery was as much a question of extortion as bribes. By 1872, the radicals were increasingly splintered. In the congressional elections of 1874, the anti-radical Democrats took control of Congress. Many former radicals joined the stalwart faction of the GOP, while many opponents joined the half-breeds, but they differed primarily on patronage rather than policy.